Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Defense One Summit, the Defense One Outlook 2022. I'm Kevin Barrett. I'm executive editor of Defense One, and thrilled to have you joining us for Selling the China Threat, our next panel, one that's close to my heart. I'm very excited for. Before we begin, we have some housekeeping notes for the audience, for all of you watching at home or wherever you are in the virtual world. On the right side of your screen, you will see a main stage chat function where you can interact with your fellow attendees. I will say this is a pre-recorded session, so we don't have live Q&A for you, but during the presentation, that does come up for all of you to interact with each other, so please have at it. I'm pleased to be joined by my excellent panelists today to discuss, again, selling the China threat. We'll get right into it. This is a unique time where we have, I think, a battle going on, a battle for whether or not China is a threat or not, a competition, a conflict, how to think about China, and it's coming at us from all directions. So here we have a great panel of three different perspectives. We have Dimitri Sevastopoulos, the US-China correspondent from Financial Times, FT, good friend of ours, longtime Pentagon correspondent who's fresh off the plane with General Milley back from Asia. We'll hear from him. We have Ivo Dalder, who's president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, who we love to go back to, who has great information and data on what people are thinking about these with their surveys that they do. And we have Dr. Tim Brooke, professor, author from the University of British Columbia, who I invited because of this book, look at me plugging away, which I really enjoyed, Great State, China, and the World, to help us think about how to think about China, how China thinks about itself, and a little history lesson as well. So let's start with the current events. Dimitri, we'll go to you. Welcome to the Defense One Summit. Great to see you. Why don't you give us a little bit of kind of what you just went through with the chairman and his travels and where we are with China. You're the U.S. China correspondent, which is actually a new gig and a new title created just because of what's going on right now, right?
It is, and first, Kevin, thanks for having me. Great to be with you. I am just off the plane, a little bit jet lagged, so I apologize for that. Yeah, we created a US-China job just to reflect the fact that China is becoming such an important part of the world. So I was on a trip with General Milley. We were in South Korea. Defense Secretary Austin was also there. And ostensibly, it was 2 days of talks about the alliance between the US and the South Korean militaries. Obviously, a huge amount of talk about North Korea. But one of the interesting things was that China was a topic of conversation between the two militaries. And actually in their communique at the end of the 2 days, they mentioned the need for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, which is the first time they've ever included that. And that came several months after President Biden and South Korean President Moon did the same thing in their joint statement after the presidential visit to the White House in May. That was the first time South Korea had ever talked about Taiwan in that kind of a document. And it gives you a flavor of how China and Taiwan are becoming bigger and bigger issues in the region. And what was interesting is while we were in South Korea with General Milley, former Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, in a different forum, actually suggested that Japan would come to support US in any kind of a conflict with China over Taiwan, which was probably the biggest statement ever to come from a Japanese politician of his stature. So even though we were on the Korean Peninsula to talk about North Korea and Kim Jong-un and his ballistic missile program and nuclear program, in the background, China is lurking larger and larger as a shadow and is really dominating every other topic out there, I think.
Yeah, we saw that news, and I think the South Korean president was asked would they also come to the defense, but kind of didn't answer the question or hemmed and hawed, right? So similar to how the Americans are also kind of not answering the question directly about what the United States would do about Taiwan. Let me set up a little more here and go to you, Ivo, because Ivo, the Chicago Council had a survey. The results came out in October. And just this weekend, we have a new survey from the Reagan Forum. The Reagan Library hosts this Reagan Defense Forum every year. It's going on, or just went on the past weekend. And so they have some maybe a little updated data, but walk us through what Americans think right now about China as a threat, what the United States should do about it, what the West should do about it, and what's different, what's new that we're seeing in these results.
Well, thanks, Kevin, and thanks for inviting me, and glad to be on this panel, such an important set of issues. The American public in many ways is following in the footsteps of where politicians, particularly many in Washington, Capitol Hill are, and frankly, both the Trump administration and now the Biden administration. They're increasingly seeing China as a threat to the United States, long seen it as a potential competitor or even a collaborator on common issues, but that's fading. More and more people now see China as the greatest threat. The Reagan survey, the Reagan Foundation survey that you just mentioned that came out just a week or so ago, now has 37% of Americans seeing China as the greatest threat to the United States. That's up from 21% just 2 years ago. So that's a massive, almost 80% increase in sentiment. And we have, in the Chicago Council surveys, have also seen a steady increase led by Republicans, then independents and Democrats, but nevertheless a steady increase of Americans seeing China as a greater threat and increasingly worried about the relative balance of power between the United States and China. For example, in our survey that was conducted in July, for the first time ever, less than a majority, only a plurality, think that the United States is the greatest military power on the world, and a plurality now thinks that China is a bigger economic power than the United States. So it just shows you the degree to which China is looming larger in the American perspective. And that's translated in some policy areas. So for the first time in our survey, and we've been doing this survey since 1974, a majority of Americans believe that the United States should use its troops to defend Taiwan in case it is attacked from China. That's a very significant change in perspective. Increasingly, Americans also believe that trade, which of course is at the center of the relationship for the last 40 years, is something that we should do less of with China. Although Americans in general are very pro-trade, think it is a good thing to have trade, when it comes to trade with China, they're much less inclined to support it, and they're much more inclined to support maintaining tariffs on China and to see the relationship with China in deeply competitive terms in both economic and industrial policy, and increasingly in security and military terms as well. So we're really seeing a public that is prepared for the kind of competition, if not confrontation, that seems to be the way much of Washington now looks at the relationship between our two countries.
Well, thanks. And a couple stats that caught my eye from both the Chicago Council survey and Reagan. The Chicago Council was the one that said less than half Americans, 46%, said the United States is stronger than China in terms of military power. I'm not sure that's even factually true, but the perception of it certainly is new and makes a difference. The other statistic that caught my eye from Reagan was the percentage of Americans who say they're concerned about possible war is now 71%. Where 3 years ago in that survey, it was 21%. I mean, that's a massive change. Tim, I'd like to turn to you. We spoke before this as well, and you told me how in the last 5 years even, there's been a significant shift in how we, the West, outsiders, perceive China, and it kind of mirrors the changes that are going on inside of China. You've been tracking this your entire career. You've written extensively on it. You've lived there. You know both sides of what's going on right now. What are the changes that are most that are catching your ear the most, that are most alarming, the ones that we should know about, and how it's affecting what people who aren't experts like you think about China?
Well, Kevin, I have a bifocal view of China. That is, with one eye, I look at what China is doing today, and with the other eye, I look at what China's been doing since the 13th century. And I'm really more back in the past than in the present, but I see a very strong connection between the two. Let me just lay down sort of 4 basic facts that have struck me over my decades as a China historian. One, China is a tightly centralized state. Now they may lose that centralization at certain points, but that is always the goal, tight centralization. Secondly, China is a territorially very large country. and expanded to its present borders in the 18th century, not unlike the United States, not unlike Russia, as it happens. So China is centralized, China is large. Thirdly, externally, China assumes that it should have regional dominance. Not global dominance, but certainly regional dominance. And the fourth point I would make is that internally, the Chinese government assumes that the Chinese people should be unified. And to assert that unity, they will remind Chinese overseas around the world that they are Chinese and that they have, they can call upon their loyalty in order to promote China's position in the world. What all of this means for the present, it's not a one-to-one relationship with the present, but there are a couple of things that are worth thinking about. One is that this tightly centralized state is very much, has been reconstructed under the current leadership. In fact, the leadership group is so tiny, so narrow at this point, that one of the wild cards may be what happens if something goes wrong with Xi Jinping, because there is no succession in place. Really, for the first time in a long time, there is no succession. And I think that's going to be a destabilizing influence. The fact that China is a large country has generated some of the biggest problems China faces today. The Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the Tibetans, Mongols, Taiwanese. China in the 18th century absorbed all of these groups into itself and is now having to deal with that. And that leads to destabilization within current borders, but also across borders as well, because there is great sympathy among Turkic Muslims throughout Central Asia for what's going on to the Uyghur people, for example. In terms of regional dominance, China has been asserting that. The business in the South China Sea is in part driven by resource concerns and by the protection of trade pathways, but it's also an exercise in reminding the rest of Eastern Asia that China is the dominant player. And in that regard, both Korea and Japan continue to be frustrating for China because they are not submitting, perhaps in the way in which China would have liked from its traditional perspective. And finally, this problem about unity. This is particularly, well, it goes back to this question of China's territorial expansion. Uyghurs don't particularly want to be Han Chinese. Tibetans don't, Mongols don't, Taiwanese don't. And this is creating, there's a kind of juggernaut of propaganda and intellectual suppression going on in China at the moment to try and create that sense of unity. And the wild card here will be that that may backfire. If to speak sort of candidly, my Chinese friends at the moment are unable to talk about anything or write about anything because everything has become sensitive to the central government. And this is leading to a kind of, I think, it's leading in the direction of internal instability. Although the Chinese Communist Party seems to think that they're creating stability, but I'm afraid there's going to be a reaction. How long in the future, I don't know, but in the next 10 years, there is going to be significant political problems inside the People's Republic.
Well, Tim, I think you had said to me too, a good point that the politics in China now and the politics inside of the United States now, both are lined up for bad news, right? These are not situations where détente is on the horizon and agreements are about to be made. It's just the opposite. It's something that's forcing people.
And we can't polarize a communist regime as doing one thing and a democratic regime as doing another, because from the point of view of those of us who are not Americans and don't live in the United States, there may be a succession problem in the United States as well, which means that foreign policy will perhaps not work to the best interests of both countries, nor to a kind of bilateral relationship. I think the United States and China are competitors. Whether there is a threat entailed in that competition, I'm going to leave to Ivo and Dmitry.
Well, Dmitry, that was my next question to you, was where are we with the actual threat of conflict? I mean, that's the storyline now. It's Taiwan, Taiwan, Taiwan. And what that really means is President Xi going to militarily take over Taiwan? Is the United States going to have to come to Taiwan's defense? Is there going to be a shooting war between the two over this island, nation / province, when, Americans, United States didn't even protect parts of Ukraine from Russia? This is the next version of that. What are officials saying in the background? What are they saying on the record about what they believe is actually the threat and what they have to prepare for?
Well, I think there's a debate about, there's no debate about the fact that China is increasing its capabilities, and at some point in the near future, if not already, will have the capability to seize control of Taiwan, although it would be a hugely bloody campaign, and you have to make sure if you're Xi Jinping that what you seize is actually there's something left after you've seized it. So it's going to be complicated one way or the other, but China's getting closer to that capability. Which is a real problem for the US. And as everyone listening knows, the US has a policy of strategic ambiguity, which means US presidents, unless they make gaffes, as Joe Biden did recently, will not say whether the US will come to Taiwan's defense in the case of a conflict with China. And the idea is they don't want to, if they think that if they say publicly we will defend Taiwan, it would give pro-independence forces in Taiwan, it would give them more confidence, and they might actually try and declare independence, which would probably spark or trigger an invasion from China. On the other hand, by being ambiguous, you hopefully give the Chinese military pause, and Xi Jinping doesn't really know what the US is going to do. The problem is that China is getting stronger and stronger, which means that US power in the world is relatively weaker. And I think, post-Afghanistan, there's been a question about whether the US has the will to get involved in some of these situations. If, for example, we asked General Milley on the flight back from Seoul yesterday, looking at Ukraine, to take a slightly different but similar example, if President Putin in Russia looking at the situation, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, deciding that the US doesn't have appetite for conflict after 20 years of war, and therefore wouldn't respond to a Russian invasion of Ukraine, General Milley said, other countries should be very careful from drawing conclusions from something like Afghanistan, and history has proven people wrong when they've done that. But the question is, for example, if there was an invasion of Ukraine and the US didn't respond, how does China view that? Does Xi Jinping say, the US did not get involved in a conflict in Europe? It's almost less likely that it'll get involved in a conflict in Asia, miles and miles away from the US, over a small island, which most Americans, even if they respond about Taiwan in polls, probably don't know that much about Taiwan. So I think it's a huge question, and people often frame it, would the US sacrifice Topeka for Taipei? Is America willing to go for war to defend this island? And I don't think anybody knows the answer, because ultimately that will be a political decision that Joe Biden or his successor will have to take if we ever get there. But on the Chinese side, there's a debate, I should say in Washington, there's a debate about Xi Jinping's intentions. So even if he has the capabilities now, some people will say he's highly unlikely to do it in the near future because it would be hugely damaging to the Chinese economy. He's certainly not going to do it over the next year because you've got the Beijing Winter Olympics in February, and he doesn't want any global problems at that time. About a year from now, you have the 20th Party Congress in China, at which point, unless things change, Xi Jinping is likely to get a third term as General Secretary of the Communist Party, and that will pave the way for an unprecedented third term as president the following year. But after that, once Xi Jinping has solidified his base even stronger, and to get to Tim's point, I mean, it really is, he has a very tight network of people advising him, but he's very strong in China right now more broadly. Does he then become emboldened in a couple of years, thinks we now have a lot more capabilities, the US looks weak, it doesn't want to get involved in conflict, now is the optimum time to take Taiwan? Some people think that that possibility is growing, and others will say, no, it's still too big a risk for China. Economic growth is the thing Xi Jinping needs to focus on most, because if the Chinese economy really slows, then people will get very unhappy, and the Chinese Communist Party's stability or its ability to survive will be threatened. So it's a huge debate. The only people who know the answer probably are Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, and so far they're not talking.
Great. I mean, that's, as you're saying all this, I'm thinking, how long do we keep thinking of Xi Jinping as a rational actor? Ivo, a lot of what Dimitri was saying is about whether Americans really want to come to the defense of these foreign lands and foreign peoples, especially after Afghanistan. But you were NATO ambassador. You know a little something about what Americans think about coming to the defense of even treaty allies, things, that something far different than what we're talking about with Taiwan. But so two different questions. One, talk about that, but also talk about this idea of, do Americans really know what they want? How much does the survey data tell us about what Americans really want when it comes to sending troops, defending Taiwan, having interest in China? Because it was pretty wishy-washy for things like, forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or how many troops or how much spending, what to do about Europe, right?
Yeah. So let me take that first, that second question first in terms of what Americans want, and I think our data has demonstrated sort of over the very consistently last 5, 6, 7 years, a general view by Americans that alliances are good for the United States, and an understanding that having alliances requires one to be willing to use military force to protect those who are attacked. So, for a long while, we have seen pretty strong numbers of maintaining forces in Europe and in Asia and the Middle East, maintaining bases overseas, and a willingness generally to defend South Korea if it gets attacked by North Korea, to defend NATO countries like the Baltics if it gets attacked by Russia, strong support for defending Japan, traditional treaty allies. And what that suggests to me is not that they know all the details or the op plans or how to figure out what will happen in the case of war, but there's a basic predisposition that military and particularly political leaders have, that the American public is going to be with them if and when it is decided that the American national security interest requires one to use military forces to make good on treaty commitments. That's sort of the way I interpret it. You don't need to build a case for a skeptical public. You need to build a case that maintains a public that's pretty forward-leaning on these issues. So that's kind of number one. On the larger issue of sort of resolve and how to think about this, which Dmitry talked about, of course, this is an issue that's been with us for the last 60 plus years. It is very difficult for a country even as big as the United States to constantly convince its allies or its partners that it is willing to cross an ocean and go to war for their defense, particularly when there is a possibility that the country you're fighting has the capacity to retaliate against the United States proper. So we've had Berlin for Boston for 50 years as a question. We've had Seoul for Seattle, or Tokyo for Topeka for a long time, and now we have Taiwan. And so the reality that we need to remember is that it is much more difficult for the United States to convince its friends that it will be there when it matters, because friends want to be 100% sure, than it is to convince enemies, because enemies don't need to be 100% sure. They need to be 100% sure that the United States is not going to intervene. And having some doubt about whether or not the United States will be there may and should have a major impact on their decision on whether or not to fight and defend oneself. So credibility and resolve are very complicated issues that, we fought an entire war in Vietnam on that basis. But the reality is deep integration, shared values, maintaining military capabilities in places is how you signal the resolve, the value, the interest that exists. And that's why alliances are so important. Dmitry is right that Taiwan is this particular case because it's not a nation, it's not a treaty ally. Or it is a nation, but it is, it has a government. It's independent but not in formal political sense. But we don't have a formal military or even strategic partnership as we do with countries in Europe and other countries in Asia, and that makes it more complicated.
Dimitri, you wanted to respond to that real quick?
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing, which was in the last couple of months, we've seen an awful lot of talk, including reports from the Pentagon, about the dramatic growth in Chinese nuclear forces. And one of the things you're seeing in the region, particularly in Japan and South Korea, but Australia, other allies and partners, is there's a concern that President Biden right now is conducting what's called a nuclear posture review, and that he may shift US nuclear posture to either say US has a policy of no first use for nuclear weapons, or what's known as sole purpose, which is to lay out the cases where the US might use nuclear weapons and where it wouldn't. A lot of the allies in Europe and Asia are concerned that this is going to weaken what's called extended deterrence, and that the kind of US nuclear umbrella that's been, in theory, protecting these countries for a long time could be weakened, and therefore countries like South Korea and Japan may have to think about developing their own nuclear weapons. So, China is looming very large in that sense as well, and that also has a big bearing on whether the US would come to Taiwan's defenses. That China now has a much, much more credible nuclear capability than it had, when the US switched diplomatic recognition to Beijing in 1979. It's a totally different game now.
Yeah, to me, so much of this seems it's duplicitous. You have, right now, people doubting the United States' either commitment or military capability. On the same time, the U.S. is pushing forward with, the new B-21 strategic bomber, stealth bomber, multi-billion-dollar, ways to deliver lethal nuclear power at a moment's notice. You just had this battle. I want to kind of bring us back to the battle of what to think about China in a world where, in the last week, the Women's Tennis Association, Professional Women's Tennis Association, has announced they're pulling all their events and stopping their events in China because one of their players, it's believed, has been coerced by the Chinese government to not speak freely about something that happened to her, and they're now considered out front of another organization like the NBA, right? The NBA will not press hard on China. They've been apologetic. LeBron James is being called out by another NBA player who writes "Free Tibet" on his shoes, saying, LeBron James and Nike is part of the problem. You have, actors being called out on this. You have businesses, an investment that's being challenged of whether or not you are a patriot or not depends on whether or not you're willing to put your money where your mouth is, or your career where your mouth is when it comes to China. And some people are on board with this and understand it and are picking sides and making decisions. But I wonder how many other people are, and how that changes people's calculus. So, Tim, for you, how people thought about China, it wasn't like this a year ago. It wasn't like this 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I mean, but in the same sense, I one cheeky thing. I have another book I want to read that caught my eye, and the sentence that caught my eye was that even in the best of circumstances, coping with China's rise in international importance will present some difficult issues, you think? And China is unlikely to become a highly disciplined member of the international community. Well, that was Kenneth Lieberthal in 1995. That was, when China was supposed to be opening up and making positive changes, not the China today, right? Right, Tim?
Yes. Well, Lieberthal was a smart observer of the China-U.S. relationship, and anything he had to say is pretty much worth listening to even today. But certainly, as a China specialist, I find this the way events have turned over the last 5 years. I won't say puzzling, but maybe disappointing that the temperature has risen over so many issues where it didn't need to rise. Now, I'll remind you, as a Canadian. Speaking as a Canadian, I had two fellow Canadians held in solitary confinement for the last 2 years, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. They've been subsequently released, but the public mood in Canada is, if you like, even more negative towards China than the mood in the United States. And for the United States in particular, less so for Canada, but for the United States in particular, there is this issue of patriotism, that if you can line up the public mood in certain ways, then you can make foreign policy decisions on that basis. But it's even more true in China. Chinese have been, they are educated from the age of 1 to be patriots of China. And this goes back to the point I was making earlier about all Chinese are expected to be loyal to China. In the case of Taiwan, Taiwan is Taiwan is a problem that Xi Jinping has chosen to create. Taiwan has existed as an independent state for 72 years. And even through the 1970s, through the 70s and 80s, when Deng Xiaoping became the leader in China, he kept up a certain rhetoric about Taiwan will eventually come back to the fatherland, but he didn't do anything about it. And it was useful as a kind of spur to Chinese people to remember that Chinese are all one thing. But what Xi Jinping is doing is now he's kind of operationalizing this, turning Taiwan into an issue at a time when I think, well, it may favor his foreign policy goals, it may favor his domestic goals, but I think in the larger run, it's going to create problems that Xi Jinping cannot solve, and that it's much more beneficial for China to have a Taiwan that can work with China and can work with the world, rather than eradicate Taiwan in the way in which he seems to be eradicating Hong Kong.
Well, I mean, the future of Xi is I think it's just the biggest X factor of all. I mean, Dimitri, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think one of the biggest shifts is a couple of things. Is one that, Deng Xiaoping had a policy of keeping a low profile, letting China grow without getting it too big for its boots until a point where it was much stronger. China is now much stronger now. So the question is Xi Jinping taking this stance because China's arrived at a point where it can put the muscle behind the rhetoric and therefore it's being more aggressive rhetorically? Or is Xi Jinping just decided to be more bolder in the world, and that this is a shift that China is projecting itself, whether it's building a blue water navy or doing other things or sending hypersonic weapons around the world? Is China now projecting itself as a global power beyond the regional power that it has clearly wanted to be for a long time? And I think that's one of the big questions that people are trying to answer.
Yeah, I mean, historically, Tim, the story of China is that I keep hearing from China experts like yourself are reminders that China is not the same type of imperial power that the West has been throughout history. There's no sign, and we shouldn't fall for this trap that China wants to take over the world, wants to invade America, maybe, and doesn't even really want to have to invade Taiwan. They just want to set the parameters for their own economic rise and unity, and that's different. And as long as the West allows that, or the United States allows that, conflict can be avoided. But not when the rhetoric is so high and politicians on one side are calling for, a full-scale arms race, and politicians on the other side are basically going along with it, right? Because nobody wants to be weak on China.
Well, I think, Kevin, the point you're making would have been truer 5 years ago than it is now. And I must say that looking back at China over the last 7 or 8 centuries, China moves in and out of a kind of proactive foreign policy. There are periods when China withdraws to its borders, wants nothing to do with the outside world except what might be of economic or defense benefit. But there are times when China is actually actively out beyond its borders. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, China found its current borders in the 18th century. Over the 17th and 18th century, it tripled in size. Now, this was an act of imperial expansion that is familiar from European history as well. What they actually do with that is I think still anyone's guess. But I'm a little worried that there in fact may be a threat to China's immediate neighbors, not to the United States. I don't see that as a threat, except maybe perhaps in a larger geostrategic sense. But in terms of an immediate sense, I see it as a bit of a threat to the states on China's borders.
Ivo, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's there's a duality here on the U.S. side, because of course, when it comes to having a conflict, it's not only what's happening in China, but also what is happening in the United States. So on the one hand, I think, Kevin, as you just pointed out, there are a whole series of actors in the United States who have invested greatly in a strong collaborative relationship with China, particularly on the economic side. And so you see Ray Dalio going out and basically saying that China is really no different than any other country. And in any case, he's going to invest in China because that's where the future is. You see Jamie Dimon going out and apologizing for saying that he hoped that Chase Bank would be around longer than the Chinese Communist Party. And you see the NBA and others, just as you mentioned, making excuses for human rights and other reasons. And yet the politics in Washington is moving very quickly in a very different direction, in a much more confrontational direction. Everybody is pulling out the old Cold War playbook. NSC 68, which is what was written by Paul Nitze as a way to think about how to deal with the Soviet Union, is becoming the way that we talk about each other. I was struck that General Hyten, the vice chair of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but previously head of the Stratcom, talked about the hypersonic missiles that the Chinese tested, and Dmitry allowed us to know about.
It's a great plug for Dmitry's and wonderful scoops that he's milking really well.
Right, exactly. In the FT, just great to read about it. But he said, that demonstrates that the Chinese are developing a first strike nuclear capability. Well, really? What it demonstrates also is that they're worried about our defenses preventing them from having a second strike, and that you want to be able to get around the defenses in order to make sure that if the United States attack, they have a means for retaliation. So, and by the way, debates that we've been having with the Soviet Union since the 50s about first strike and second strike and what does it all mean, but it is just same playbook that is really easy for us to pull out. And I find a lot of people in Washington on Capitol Hill, and I must say both in this administration and the previous administration, are falling into the same kinds of things. Now, final point, there are reasons to be worried about what the Chinese are doing. And I think certainly the degree to which they are arming themselves and the rapidity of what they're doing, the kind of military actions they're taking in the Himalayas, that they've been taken in the South China Sea with regard to other parts of the world, are deeply concerning. And I'm not in any way wanting to suggest that they're not a challenge or even a threat, but we have to be very careful that we don't get drawn into this sense of an enemy, which the US tends to have. There are many things we need the Chinese for, whether it's dealing with climate change, whether it's dealing with this pandemic, which is coming back for us now, and how to do that subtly and well, diplomatically, innovatively, is really what it's about, not about are we going to have a Cold War or not, or are we going to fall victim to that kind of thinking. That's the challenge for the United States. Frankly, it's a challenge for Canadians, as it is for our friends in Europe and in Asia as well. And I'm worried that selling a threat is so much easier than being subtle about the actual nature of the challenge that we're facing.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you, you're asking for nuance from the masses, and you're asking for nuance from political leaders. And as Dmitry knows, that's not what you get from a Marco Rubio or from an Elizabeth Warren, or when we have a politics right now where there's loud voices on the extremes that are there's a mix of anti-foreign intervention, but super hawk, arm up, and being tough on China was something you had to be to win the presidency, right? Beijing Biden was a hashtag that the Trump campaign early on put out with a whole lot of memes trying to make Biden look like he was a friend to China and not a foe. And you have to be a foe or you're weak. It's already being set up like that. I mean, Dmitry, tell me about your reporting since this beat started. I don't know anybody else who has a beat like yours. I mean, in Washington, we've got Pentagon reporters, we've got State Department reporters, we have White House reporters and Congress reporters, and rarely they all meet, unfortunately. But this is an issue like we're talking about. It's all of the above. So brilliantly, I think FT created this position, and you're killing it. Good for you. That's why I have you here. Tell us how the conversation has changed, and is Evo onto something? Is there a chance that there will be a nuanced future that's not either you're with us or against us?
I think back to when I covered the Pentagon during the Bush administration, and it was mostly Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo, Iran, but I would sometimes do China stories, and it was very easy to talk to China officials because they weren't getting any attention. Back then, China wasn't getting the kind of attention it is today. There was probably a a misperception of the direction China was going in, but there was more of a debate. It was easier for people to voice their opinions. What I found astounding taking over this job on January 20th is how little debate there is now. If you say anything positive about China, you're basically portrayed as being incredibly weak and you're unpatriotic and you're not American. And that's dangerous. That's dangerous for America because not everything that China is doing is bad. And to paint it as if it is like frankly ridiculous. But one of the curious things I think is that, if you look at Congress, everyone is very vocal about what a threat China is and how important it is for America to step up. There are probably more pieces of China legislation have been introduced in the US Congress this year than on any other topic. It's the one major issue where Democrats and Republicans largely agree, at least on the threat, if not on the solution. And yet there's been almost no major or even minor China legislation has passed the Congress. Even the authorization to fund money for the CHIPS Act to make the semiconductor situation better, that hasn't been funded. And so you have an authoritarian regime in China where Xi Jinping says go and everybody runs and no one's going to stop them, pretty much. And you have a government here that, and I'm also, not an American, I'm looking from the outside, even though I'm here. It seems to be paralyzed, and the partisan fights between Republicans and Democrats somehow don't allow America to move in the direction in a united way that it needs to be to tackle China. And the hysteria about China, a lot of which is justified, but not all of it, means you can't have a nuanced conversation. And one of the things that stunned me is when I quote someone on China who maybe is not the most hawkish of people, I will get texts from people saying, why did you quote that person? And sometimes it happens in the reverse direction too. And my response to these people is, this never used to happen in the past. You're all asking me to be like Xi Jinping and to censor myself, and I'm not going to do that. But it's an illustration of just how difficult the China story has become here, how big and how difficult, and how I think people are struggling to get their arms around it in the US government.
That's amazing to hear you say that about quotes. Again, it just shows. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to ask you guys to give me all your final thoughts and think about the solutions or the prescriptions or the direction forward, mainly to keep us out of war, to keep us out of each other. And if we're in the beginning of whatever you want to call it, a Cold War or not, we're in the beginning of a new relationship that could be going on for the rest of our lifetimes. And this is the foundational defining, these are the defining moments. This is, the missile gap in the 60s, this is wherever we are. How do we, get to a point where, as Dimitri is saying, where we're not so cut and dry, so with us against us, so polarized that the only, pathway for not only Americans or the West, but the Chinese is conflict as one power comes up and the other one seemingly declines. Tim, you want to take us out?
Sure. It's very frustrating to watch this, the polarization within the United States that Dimitri has talked about, but this polarization around the world, as though it's China against everyone else. There are issues that separate what the Chinese government does and says from what is being done and said elsewhere in the world. And I think the best that we in the West can do is to maintain a principled stand on issues that are fundamental to the United Nations vision of the world order. Not to go back to kind of 19th century great power situations where you don't compromise or pay attention to the interests of other states. But we have an international system. It's flawed, but it's all we've got. And as long as the issues that matter are addressed as issues over which there may be disagreement, then maybe we can all move forward, and maybe China will step down a little bit too. I think in a sense, the anti-China mood in the world is pushing Xi Jinping into a more aggressive stance. That said, I've watched sort of a nuanced negotiation go on over the decades, and it's not clear what the outcome is going to be. So as long as nuance and principled stands are not cover for politics, but that is then a particular problem in the United States at the moment. And it's a particular problem in China too. There are Chinese who feel differently, but who have no, they cannot add their voice to create a different conversation. So we're in a difficult moment.
Ivo, you did your survey 6 months from now, a year from now. Are we going to continue to see these trends?
Yeah, I think unfortunately we are, and that makes it all the more difficult for us to manage the relationship in a way that reduces the chances of conflict and war, because ultimately that is what it is about. And I think we learned during the Cold War how to do that. And I think if there's one piece where I do think the Cold War is relevant, is that we were able to compete and have a dialogue at the same time. And we created in the mid-1960s, after a confrontation in the Cuban Missile Crisis, a pathway of dialogue that lasted for 50 years with the Soviet Union and Russia. That dialogue recognized that there were fundamental differences, that those differences might not be resolved anytime soon. But there was one thing that we all agreed on, and that was whatever the differences were, war was not the answer. And put together a series of agreements, from accidents at sea to what we do in outer space, to notifying each other when we are taking certain military tests and steps and exercises, in order to reduce the chances of miscalculation and war. And I would hope that there is a real incentive for the Chinese to respond, because the Biden administration is hoping to have this kind of dialogue. And I think it's right to look at that kind of dialogue, for the Chinese to respond positively. It's ultimately in everyone's interest, and that includes the Chinese, to not have wars you don't want. It's one thing to have wars you do want. It's quite another thing to have wars which you don't want. And I think spending time thinking about how you bring that about, learning, in fact, from what we did accomplish in incredibly difficult times back in the 60s and the 70s and onwards, is relevant for this relationship.
Dimitri, final thoughts.
I think, as the Chinese military gets stronger and stronger, the importance of deterrence only increases. And I think one of the things the US is doing, and will need to do more, is to make sure that the allies and partners are united to the extent that's possible, whether that's the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians and others in Asia, and the Europeans. And you have seen, a fair amount of convergence, for example, between the US and the European Union on China. Even if it's not 100% convergence, there's been a big shift. I think that's really important. And if the world unites and says to Xi Jinping, you're taking too big of a risk, it may have an impact. It may not, but it's going to give you a better chance. I think where the big gap is corporate deterrence, that, US companies are, massively interested in the Chinese market. Anytime we write stories about things happening in China, frankly, so many of them bury their head in the sand and don't want to talk to us because they're afraid of getting dragged into a conversation about Xinjiang or forced labor. But, you talked earlier about the case of Peng Shuai and how the Women's Tennis Association had picked up. I think that is a huge moment in relations with China, because if other sports groups, if other companies actually start to follow that lead, it will have an impact, because China is most worried. It is worried about US aircraft carriers and bombers and weapons, but it's most worried about its economy, because if the economy slows, the Communist Party starts to face a threat. And therefore, you need American companies, you need investment. And I think, if companies stepped up to the plate and put more pressure on China instead of being cowed the way they are right now, it would have a big impact. But it's very difficult because they all have so much to lose as well. And so that is a very difficult situation. But I think Peng Shuai, that case is actually hugely important, and people should pay more attention to it.
Yeah, and I raised it because I tend to try to keep an ear on what Ivo's doing on the surveys data of what people really think about these foreign policy issues and attitudes. Again, Dimitri and I, we're world Pentagon reporters, right? So we can have a narrow focus of our narrow beats, but there's so much more when it comes to the China question, especially. There's such a bigger relationship than just the counting the missiles in each other's arsenals and what to come from it. we're going to keep a close watch on this for all of our audience out there. I highly recommend you subscribe to FT and follow Dimitri. Follow him on Twitter. He's doing some of the best work out there. You should all definitely go buy a copy of Tim's book and read it. It's a wonderful story. 13 stories throughout history that exemplify the relationship, how China's relationship with the world changes and grows. It's fascinating. I really, really enjoyed it. You should definitely all go to the Chicago Council site and savor all this. I'd say, you know, I'm doing my homework too. I got John Pomfret's book. I got Rush's book too. You know, we all were Afghanistan and Iraq experts, and before that, everyone were Soviet experts. So it all comes around. But pay attention, everyone. What matters of how we think about China, what the politicians are going to do, what comes next, and maybe it's the Olympics. It's Beijing in the winter. We'll see what kind of boycotts and what kind of pressures come down. Tim, Ivo, Dimitri, thank you all very much for your time. And for the rest of you, please continue to stay tuned for the rest of the Defense One Summit Outlook 2022 the rest of the week. Thank you for joining us.